Hello everyone. My name is Elise. Welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing so good today. We're doing my stats slash goals check-in for the end of the year, for the end of 2023. And I love these stats videos. If you love stats, welcome. This is the place for you, my friend. And if you have stats about your own reading that you want to share, please share those down below because again, I love them. I think it's so fun to just look at some of the different characteristics and categories of your reading. I also think it can be a useful way to identify some blind spots in your reading as well. And I just love doing it. I feel like every year I start tracking a little bit and a little bit more. And I like that trajectory for me. I think there will come a time where I'll hit a point where too much tracking will make me not want to do it. But so far, gradually I'm doing a little bit more over time and I really enjoy doing that. So I'm excited to get into it all with you. We're also going to be going over my 2023 goals and whether or not I achieved them. So that will be the second half of the video. And yeah, buckle up because we're going to go over a lot of numbers today. So in 2023, and I will say I'm using Storygraph for a lot of the stats. There are a couple that I track on my own, but those will be more in the goal section. So highly recommend Storygraph if you like stats. They have amazing ones. And we'll start with the amount of books that I read for the year. So I read 101 books for the year, and I read 25,297 pages. Now I know Storygraph and Goodreads have slightly different page count numbers for different books, but that's the ballpark, who knows, around that. This is less than I read in 2022. I felt like I read a little bit less. It's less in the books total, it's less in the page count. So yeah, that tracks for my reading for the year. And Storygraph does do moods, which I really like as well. Of course, I think like most people, my highest one is always the reflective and emotional, but I think that's just because most books are probably a little reflective and emotional, so a lot fits into that category. But outside of that, there was dark and mysterious, I think, as the next two moods. So I think, again, that also matches with how I felt about my reading year. And then here's a little lovely graph of the books and pages I read per month in 2023. As you can see, there is a dip in the middle of the year. This is definitely when I got injured. So I was on crutches for a very long time, almost 2 months. And that impacted my reading a lot more than I thought it would, because I just wasn't walking and I listen to audiobooks while I walk. So that went down and dipped. That's part of why I read less in this year, but it really starts shooting back up at the end. And I'm happy to see it because I definitely want to be reading because I love it so much. But yeah, it's funny for me to look at that now. And then in terms of the genres that I spent the most time with, here is another little graph. This is similar to what it is most years. There's always literary and contemporary at the top, which how they're dividing those out, I have no idea. And then mystery is always pretty high up there. This year, a lot of them were Sherlock Holmes, or I also finished the Veronica Speedwell series, or at least caught up at the beginning of the year as well. So I think between both of those, that's 8 novels just between Veronica Speedwell and Sherlock Holmes. So that accounted for a lot of them, and I enjoyed that reading very much. And then LGBTQIA+, that's not a genre, but I appreciate them keeping track of that nonetheless. That's always pretty high as well. And then poetry is up there with exactly 10 books. And the average page length of book that I read was 247 pages. Again, this is about pretty similar to what it is each year. It's around 250, and that stayed about the same. I did have a goal of reading some bigger books this year, and we'll get into that in the goals area. But yeah, I think I have a good mix of some really short ones and some long ones. And then there are a few authors that I read from multiple times. Like we've already talked about, I read 5 books from Arthur Conan Doyle because I read 5 Sherlock Holmes books. I read 4 books from Annie Ernaux, 3 books from Deanna Raybourn, 3 books from Melissa Broder. And yeah, I really enjoyed the authors that I read multiples from this year. I had a good amount that I read 2 from as well. I'll put that all up here so you can see in a little bit more detail. But I like reading a couple books from a few different authors in a short amount of time to really compare and contrast and dive deeper into their work. I think it can add something to the reading experience. Sometimes it takes away, but sometimes it adds, and I enjoyed that. I'm looking forward to some of the authors that I'll read multiples from in 2024 as well. And my average rating was 3.8, which I think is pretty high. To have almost a 4.0 average, because 4 and above are books that I'm really enjoying, I think is really good. Now on my channel, I don't always give the star ratings. Sometimes I do to add context, but most of the time I don't. But in here, I do keep track because it helps me filter a little bit more easily when I'm trying to make videos. So 3.8 I feel really good about. I do think that was about what it was last year as well. And in terms of the star ratings breakdown, I'll also show you this little graph. So the 5-star reads I had were 21. That's great. I think that means I loved a lot of the books I was reading. 4-star reads, we have 41. 3-star reads, we have 37. And 2 stars, we have 2. I don't have any 1 stars. I don't think I've ever had a 1 star because I will DNF a book if I'm not liking it that much. And I don't keep track of my DNFs. Who knows how many books I DNF throughout the year, but they're not impacting my ratings at all because I don't rate them. And Storygraph also does this really interesting thing where it tells you the month that you had your highest ratings in, your highest average rating. And for me, that month was August. So in August, I had a 4.14 star rating. So high. I remember in August for my wrap up talking about how good of a month it was. So that makes sense. And July was my lowest average rating at 3.33. I think that also makes sense for looking back at some of the books that I read then. And then the most pages that I read was in December. Again, that tracks. I was trying to fit in some big books at the end of the year, and that definitely blew up my page count as well. And the last thing that I'll talk about in terms of stats are the new to me authors. So I read 83 books that were from new to me authors, so I hadn't read from before, and that is amazing. I really like trying to read from new authors. I don't ever want to get to a place where I'm just reading the same people over and over and over. But yeah, feel good about that. Excited for new authors to me in 2024 as well. So that is the stats portion of the video. And now we're going to go ahead and get into some of the goals. In 2023, I had the most reading goals I've ever had in a year, and I enjoyed it. You'll see in my 2024 goals video, which will come out sometime in January, I'll be doing something a little bit different this year, but 2023 I had the most goals I've ever had, and it definitely made me be more intentional with my reading, and I did enjoy the goals that I set for myself. So the first one is just my overall books reading goal. This doesn't really matter. I don't follow this too closely, but I set it to 75. I set it to a number that's always very doable for me. It doesn't feel like I'm pressuring myself to read more because 75 I will read fairly easily. So definitely made it to the 75. Again, I read 101 books, so made it past that, and that's less than I typically read. The next goal was one that challenged me for sure, and that is reading 5 Picante Beef Babies, or books over 500 pages. I really don't read super long books. I don't even own a lot of them. So I noticed this pattern of me putting off longer books because I was finding them intimidating and thinking oh, it's gonna take me so long to get through that. Is that really what I want to read? But obviously I have those books because I'm interested. So I wanted to push myself to get to them a little bit more, and this goal was an attempt to do that. I was behind in this goal all year. In the first 6 months, I had only read one. Only one, and I've read it in January, and I was very concerned that I was not going to meet this. But I'm happy to say, folks, that I did it. Thank you. Thank you. I read 5 and I made it just in the nick of time because my last one was my very last book of the year and I finished it on December 31st. So I barely made it, but I did make it. And the 5 books that I read for this were Blankets by Craig Thompson. It's a graphic work that is auto-fictional and very wintry. Then I read Ossiball, which was in my favorite books of the year. Loved it. That is a nonfiction work about interviews with residents from a Swedish village called Ossiball. Next up, I read Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. I read that because I wanted to see the movie, so read the book first. Really enjoyed that. I was like truly obsessed with watching the original trilogy of The Hunger Games this year. I watched like all 4 of them 3 separate times. So it's like 12 movies. That's a lot. And yeah, I was in deep. So it felt appropriate to read that. And then I saw the new movie in theaters twice. So there's been a lot of Hunger Games action for me this year and enjoyed that one overall. I have some qualms about it, but I enjoyed it overall and think it was a good addition and a really good prequel. Then next up we have Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee. This is a Korean family saga that spans almost 100 years, and I enjoyed that one as well. And then lastly, the one I finished on the last day of the year was Collected Works by Lydia Sandgren, translated from the Swedish by Agnes Broom, and that made it into my best books of the year as well. Thoroughly enjoyed that. It's its own family saga in a much different way, about a trio of friends growing up and then their kids in the future and what happens when the mother disappears from their lives. Something that I've noticed about the big books is, one, I really enjoyed the vast majority of them. I would say Blankets was my least favorite, but the other ones I thought were pretty solid, and 2 of them made it into my best books of the year. So this tells me that reading big books is definitely good for me. It's something that I want to continue doing. I'm sort of switching up this goal in the future, but you'll find out more a little bit later. But I really did enjoy having this goal and I liked that it pushed me. I'm so happy that I was able to make it. Did the Picante Beef Baby goal, so I'm very happy about that. Next up is a goal that I have every year, and that is read 1 translated book a month. Now, I tend to read much more translated works than that, but I have this goal because, as I've talked about before, I want to consistently be picking up translated works. I don't want to just be reading them for like readathon or whatever it might be. I want to be consistently picking them up and for that to be a habit for me. So for this goal, I use a Storygraph reading challenge. Normally there's one created by someone else, so I just join someone else's challenge. And I always just count the first translated book I read in a given month for this goal. So I'm going to go through the ones that I counted for this challenge. This is going to be pretty rapid fire, so I'm not going to go over the author or anything like that. I'm just going to say the title and put the picture up. So January, I read Family Album. February, I read The Wall. March, I read Jawbone. April, I read Assassin of Reality. In May, I read Little Eyes. June, I read Happening. July, I read My Annihilation. August, I read The Book of Eve. September, I read Down with the Poor. October, I read Where the Wild Ladies Are. November, The Devil of the Provinces. December, Old Lady Voice. So yeah, those are the books that I counted towards that challenge this year. I have already joined another one for 2024. So if you are also interested in this challenge of trying to pick up 1 translated book a month, feel free to go and join that. I will put the link to that specific challenge down below in the description box. So feel free to join a group of people that are doing this. So that is another tick. And that one, again, it tends to be pretty easy, but I always want to have it. The next one is another translated goal, and this is a new one for me, and I was trying to read 30% of my reading in translated literature. The year before, when I added it up at the end of the year, I had read 23% of my reading was translated works. So I wanted to bump it up to 30. I felt like that was definitely a challenge, but wasn't so out of reach compared to what I had previously done. And I'm happy to report that I did this one as well. So in 2023, 34.6% of my reading was translated. So that's 1 in every 3 books, which I'm so happy with. I love that 1 in every 3 books I picked up was translated. I definitely want to continue to read translated literature because I want to decolonize my bookshelves and my reading and hear about a wider range of perspectives than just the very US and Eurocentric perspectives that we get written in English. So very happy with that number. And this year, I not only tracked the translated works in general that I was reading, which this year it was 35 books I read were translated, but I also started tracking the countries that I was reading from and the language that I was reading from. So sorry to future release, but I'll put a little graphic in that shows the countries and the languages that I was reading from if you want to pause and look at it a little bit more thoroughly. But I will just point out the countries that I read the most from were France and Japan. That I think is to be expected a little bit because there's just more translated literature from those countries, but I do maybe want to move the needle a little bit. So from France, I read 7 books. A large portion of that was Annie Ernaux because I read 4 Annie Ernaux books this year. And then from Japan, I read 6 books. And then the next highest goes all the way down to 3, which is Sweden. I read 3 books from. There were a few that I categorized just as various. So it had multiple authors that were from a range of different countries. These were the Calico editions. So one of the Calico editions was a group of authors that were all translated from Swahili, but they're from different countries. I just counted that as various. And then also a poetry collection in their Calico series that was all translated from Arabic, but from different countries. So yeah, just interesting for me to get to look at and keep track of. I'm excited to have some year-over-year data as I go into 2024. And if you are interested in more, of course, look at the graphic and check out what you find there. All right, and a new piece of tracking that I did this year is trying to track my small presses. I didn't do this last year, so it was brand new and it was just a goal to track it, and I definitely did. In 2023, I read 41 books from small presses, and that accounted for 40.5% of my reading. I'm really happy with that number as well. I think part of me is like, ooh, I'd love to get it to 50%. I do know that this year I had somewhat of an added complication of basically in the entire year of 2023, my local branch of the library was under construction, so it was not open. So I couldn't get physical books from the library. I could only get audiobooks, and a lot of times the small presses don't have an audiobook to go along with the release. So I had to buy the book if I wanted to read it. So that did impact this a little bit. So I'm hoping in future years when my local branch of the library opens back up that I'll be able to bump the number a little bit, but I'm not sure when that will be. So yeah, feel really good about the 40%. And who knows, maybe in one of the future years, I'll have a goal around that one as well. And I also tracked the specific small presses or independent publishers that I was reading from. And I read from exactly 30 different independent publishers or small presses. I feel really good about that as well, and that was very fun for me to track. And again, I'm looking forward to year-over-year data to see which ones I read from most consistently. I would imagine some of the bigger ones might pop up pretty consistently for me, but the ones I read the most from in 2023 were Coffee House Press. I read 5 books by them. I did have the Coffee House Press subscription for a portion of the year, so that definitely has impacted that number, although I read a couple backlists from them as well. I also read 5 books from 7 Stories Press. Again, this is impacted by Annie Ernaux. 4 of those books were by her, and then 1 by another author. And then New Directions, I read 4 books from throughout the year. So those were my highest numbers from a specific publisher. And again, I'll put a little graphic so you can see individually which ones I read and how many I read by them. All right, so the last goal that we have, drum roll please, is the books in and out. I talk about this frequently throughout the year for myself because I track at the end of every month how many physical books came into my TBR and how many physical books I read off of my TBR. I have said before, I have a slightly convoluted way of tracking this number, but it really just is like physical books I'm bringing in. I don't count gifts. So anything that I'm choosing to bring into my TBR physically, and read books are anything that I physically read off of my TBR. So it doesn't count library books, it doesn't count books I borrow from other people, and it also doesn't include unhauls if I didn't complete them. That's the logic in my brain, and this is always the hardest goal for me. I'll give you the stats from 2022. So in 2022, my books in was 127 and my books out was 79. Okay, so it's a pretty big discrepancy. I would say like we're looking at just over 50 books difference. And this year, the number that I have for books in is 103. So it went down pretty significantly from last year. And the books out is 79. So it's the exact same number as 2022, which was wild when I first saw that. So I did not meet this goal. The goal is to have them be equal to one another. And really, that's not so much because I want to read down my TBR or anything like that. It's just because I want to be able to read all of the books that I'm bringing in so they don't just like sit there and never get read. That's really why I want them to be equal. So let's talk about this a little bit. Let me defend myself a little bit. So I am really happy with the lowering of the discrepancy of those two numbers. So right now we're looking at a difference of 24 books. I feel really good about that compared to last year when it was like around 50 books. So yeah, feel really good about that. I will say I also read less books this year. I talked about that a little bit earlier. I read less books and that also affected this number. But I think even though I read less books, I still had the same amount of books out, which I think shows that I read less library books overall this year. Now, I still want to use my library. Clearly, I still did, but I definitely read more off of my shelves, and I think that was a good shift for me, especially because I was reading less to try and keep that number up. And I'm also really happy that I bought less this year. Again, I don't want to stop buying books. I love buying books. I love supporting the industry, and I'm privileged to be able to do that. That's never going to stop happening, but I brought it down a little bit. I reined it in a little bit, and it's closer to the amount that I can actually read in a year. So overall, I feel good about it, even though I didn't meet it. I am still gonna have this goal for next year, so spoiler for that video, and I am going to try in earnest to meet it next year. I feel like third time is a charm, so hopefully we get there. And yeah, thank you for sticking with me through all of my stats and my goals. Please, again, let me know any interesting data you got from your reading this year, if you met your goals or not for 2023. And I will see you all in my 2024 goals video. Let's hope it goes well. So I will see you all in the next one. Bye.